So then the debate comes, oh, what are we going to do about these taxes that are expiring? Now, we've had a number of years to think about it, but nobody wanted to do anything about it. But now after the election, we're starting to say, hey, this really may be a problem. And the president, because the buck stops with him to a large degree, has been the first to acknowledge within the Democrat groups between Reid, Pelosi, and the president's saying, hey, we better do something about this, if nothing else. Whether he's seen the light, at least he felt the heat in the November elections. So the question then is, you've got this pattern of all 5 of these things being wrong: the taxes, the red tape, the uncertainty, the liquidity problems of the banks, and the federal spending. All of these things are done the wrong way. And so the Republicans, because things have been so polarized, we voted no on all of this stuff. It's quite clear that there is this sharp contrast between what we're going to do. Now the contrast becomes more blurred with the proposal of trying to do something at the last minute with the Bush tax cuts. So we're going to take a look at that in a minute, and what is the nature of those tax cuts, and what was the effect when the tax cuts went into effect. So moving along, we continue to see the deficit under the Democrat budgets. Now, there was a lot of talk that the Republicans under Bush overspent, and it's true that the Republicans did overspend. You can take a look at some of these. 2002, you had a $400 billion debt here. It went down until we get to 2008. This was this is under Speaker Pelosi's Congress, but you had $459 billion when Bush was president of deficit, and that a lot of people objected to and said, hey, that's terrible. We're going to change these elections around. We're going to elect a different president, and et cetera, et cetera. So these were the Bush years, and now look, all of a sudden here you get to 2009 with Obama, and you've got these trillion-dollar deficits, which are 3 times the very worst that Bush ever had. So we're talking about a level of spending that's unprecedented. So when we use the term in this chart, stupendous spending, it really is stupendous spending. It's unlike anything we've seen before, and it makes George Bush look like some sort of a Scotch Presbyterian or something, because he's not spending at all compared to this trillion-dollar operation that's going on here. Of course, that results in unemployment. Now, I've been critical of the Democrat policies because historically and economically they're going to create unemployment. They've done that. And so the question is, do you want more bureaucrats and food stamps, or do you want jobs and paychecks? That's what America has to answer. Now, what's the solution to this? And one of the proposals is to not let these tax cuts expire. Now, then the question becomes, well, then doesn't that add to the deficit? Well, part of it does and part of it doesn't. That's kind of the interesting thing that goes on here. If you continue to pay people for not working, which is extending unemployment, and certainly because there is a high level of unemployment, that's appealing. But the trouble is the unemployment is created by those terrible policies of too much taxes, too much federal spending, the uncertainty and the liquidity and those other component parts. So here's the solution to some degree, and that is when you cut taxes, in fact what happens is you don't build a deficit, you reduce the deficit. Well, how could that be? If you cut taxes, it means the government gets less money, doesn't it? If the government gets less money and it keeps spending at the same rate, doesn't that mean that you have more and more deficits? The answer is no, because of a very interesting effect that was first made public, I suppose, by an economist by the name of Laffer, quite a cheerful fellow. He was here in the Capitol no more than a few weeks ago. He was an economist under the days of Ronald Reagan. And what he has shown is this red line is the rate of the total federal tax. This is the blue lines are the total federal tax receipts in dollars, and this is the top marginal income tax here, going from all the way up at 90%, dropping way down. And as the top marginal rate, that is the rate on all of these supposedly rich people, who, by the way, the rich people are the ones, a lot of them, own those businesses that create the jobs. So if you tax them into the dirt, what's going to happen to the jobs? You won't have jobs. You broke the code. if you really want jobs, you're going to have to allow some people to keep some of their wealth and reinvest in their business. So what Laffer is saying here is as we dropped historically, as we dropped this top tax rate, take a look at what happens to the total tax receipts of the federal government. The tax receipts are going up as the taxes are going. Doesn't that seem counterintuitive? Doesn't that seem as though you're making water run uphill? The answer is no, it's not. And here's, I think, a simple way to try and understand it, and it helps cast light on the votes that are coming up here later this week, and perhaps even the week of Christmas. There has been certainly the threat that we'll come in on Christmas week and maybe New Year's week as well. It's interesting that we couldn't get our business done, so we're going to try and jam it all in at the last minute. And it's also interesting to see what the real priorities are. But so then, what's this saying? Well, for instance, let's say that you are made king for a day or king for a year, and your job is to try to raise as much revenue for your kingdom as you can so you can run your government. And you're allowed to do one thing. You can tax a loaf of bread. Now, you start thinking and contemplating, and you say to yourself, well, if I were to charge 1 penny tax on every loaf of bread, and there's millions of loaves that are sold, why, we'd raise some money. Then you say, hey, instead of a penny, what happens if I charge $10 for a loaf of bread? Well, then, certainly that would make a difference. If we charge $10, you get much more. Then you think, well, wait a minute. Nobody would buy any bread if you put $10 tax on it. And so you start thinking to yourself, there's probably some optimum between a penny and $10 where I would get the most revenue on the bread. And if I were to raise the tax, I'd actually lose revenue because more and more people wouldn't buy any bread. And so I'd actually have my tax revenue go down even though I raise the taxes. On the other hand, if I lower the tax too much, then it'll get as much revenue as I could. So there's an optimum point, and that's what Laffer is really pointing out here, that the taxes are so high that when you actually drop the tax, the federal government makes more money. And you can see it. This is one graphical display. This is just talking about the top marginal income tax rate. We're going to see it even in a larger scale as we take a look specifically at the Bush tax cuts in 2001, particularly the Bush tax cut of May of 2003. So how then does this whole, how did things unfold then back in 2003? I have some charts I think you'll find very interesting. I have 3 charts in a row, and the line that appears right here in all 3 charts is for May 2003. These are the years across here. This is 2001 March. There was a bunch of tax cuts here. You can see that the job creation isn't looking too solid in here. Some of the tax cuts we did were politically feel-good kinds of things, give people some more money to spend and a few things like that. But there was another tax cut which was part of this whole series in May of 2003. And what we're going to focus on is this tax cut. This was capital gains, dividends, and death tax. Now, those are not popular tax cuts because it seems like they're tax cuts for people that have more money. But again, the people that have more money are also the ones that are driving a lot of those businesses that have the jobs. So let's take a look at what happens. This is May 2003, and we introduce the tax cut to cut the capital gains, to cut the death tax, and the interest, the dividend rate. So let's take a look. So this is pre-tax relief. This is job creation. Every line that goes down indicates that we've lost jobs out of the economy. Now that's what we've been doing now for a number of years. We've been losing jobs out of the economy. This isn't good. We don't want to lose jobs. Why do we lose jobs? Because we're violating the basic principles of economics. Now we were losing jobs during these early years. We did some tax cuts, but the tax cuts didn't seem to turn this around, which suggests that not all tax cuts necessarily are going to lose jobs, or not going to create jobs. But here we go, May 2003, and take a look at what happens now to job creation. All the lines going up are creating jobs. Now you can see there's a pretty good difference between here before the tax cut and after the tax cut. And so we see the immediate reflection in terms of jobs. Now, is jobs the only thing created by this tax cut? That's kind of an interesting. This is what we've been saying all the way along for a couple of years now. my Republican colleagues and I have respectfully stood on the floor, said we love the Democrats, but they're doing everything wrong to the economy. They're going to create unemployment. They're going to create distress in the economy. They're going to make it hard for businesses, and you're going to ship jobs overseas. We've been saying that. We're saying this is not going to work. You're not going to be able to reduce the deficit. You're going to increase the deficit, and you're going to break the back of America economically if you keep on. And we've been saying this over and over again from this floor, and now the numbers after the last few years indicate that that's exactly what's happening. But the fact of the matter is we don't have to not learn from history. We can learn something from history here, and that is that this tax cut particularly seems to have done an awful lot to change the job picture. Now, of course, you could always make the case. You could say, well, maybe it wasn't the tax cut that produced this effect. Maybe something else was going on here that would explain this. The only other thing that's happening in the economy here is, and that is Greenspan has got the interest rate at close to zero, and that, of course, is driving a big real estate bubble, we now know. And that's what happens when the Fed drops their interest rate very low. You have all of this easy money looking for some place to invest. In this case, they landed on real estate and created a big problem. So you could say that the interest rate being low could contribute to this, but it's interesting that you get this very stark and immediate contrast when this tax cut goes into place. So let's continue this, because it's kind of a little bit of a piece of history that's going to inform us where we need to be in the decisions going into the new year. Here is the same tax cut here. This is, again, the beginning of '03, but this is gross domestic product. And, of course, that's a measure of the overall productivity or the efficiency of the U.S. economy. This is pre-tax relief. The average GDP was 1.1%. You can see it was not only 1.1%, wasn't great for GDP, but it also was kind of spotty. You had this one, we're actually going down in gross domestic product, and these numbers were not very hot. And then you go to the tax cut, capital gains, dividends, and death tax. Now, this is only carrying the thing over to 2006. These are older charts, but they're interesting charts. You can see the effect afterwards, at least it appears to be an effect of going from 1.1 to 3.5, depending which year. But the difference is that it's a marked difference. Now, the scary question this then suggests is, if there is a causal relationship between this tax cut, which allowed business people to make more investment in American businesses, if there's a causal relationship, what happens if you turn the economics upside down and do it in reverse? What happens if that tax cut goes away? What does that mean relative to job creation? If all of a sudden this thing, this event, which created more jobs, what happens if you do it upside down? Isn't it logical that if these tax cuts expire, that it will have a reverse effect? It will do the very thing opposite of what it did when it went the other way. That's a scary thought. Because if all of a sudden we have now 9 or 10% unemployment, and we do something to make that worse, that's not a very good idea. That's why even moderates and even the president is starting to say, I'm not so sure we want to burden America with the biggest tax increase in the history of the country right at the time when it's not at all clear that we're even out of the last recession. There are some people that are optimistic. They think, oh, we've pulled out of the other recession that we're in. I'm not so sure. And I measure that based on those same 5 points we've been talking about. That is the problem with excessive taxes, the problem with excessive red tape, the uncertainty created by all kinds of government actions in the marketplace, the liquidity problem in the banks, and, of course, excessive federal spending.